Alright, so in this video I'm going to talk about coterminal angles, and I'm going to briefly recap what a coterminal angle is, and then I'm going to take a look at a 30-degree angle, a degree, and a negative pi/4 angle in radians, and we're going to talk about finding some coterminal angles and then drawing them as well. So let's go ahead and read our directions here. It says, identify all angles that are coterminal with the given angle, then find and draw one positive and one negative angle coterminal with the given angle. So let's recap what a coterminal angle is. A coterminal angle is an angle that has the same initial side and the same terminal side wherever the end of my angle is, but it has a different measure. So it's something that in the picture might look similar to 30 degrees because it has the same initial and terminal side, but it's going to have a different measure. It's not going to be equal to 30 degrees. It's going to be equal to another degree. Okay, so let's think about that. Anytime I have an angle, like here 30 degrees, I could draw it if I start here with my initial side. 30 degrees would be, a sketch of it would be roughly about this size, about a third of this 90-degree piece right here. Okay. So a coterminal angle with 30 degrees right here would have this same initial side and this same terminal side, but it would have a different measure. So if I start at this initial side, and for example, I go all the way around the circle and keep going 30 more degrees, I would end up back here. And if I started at my initial side and I went backwards, I could also end up here. Those could be a couple examples of how I could get to that same place. So what you notice is that all of these that end up in the same place are a full circle away from each other, either forward or backwards. So the way we find all angles coterminal with this given angle is we take our angle, 30 degrees, and we add a full circle, 360 degrees, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, or -1, -2, -3 times backwards as well. So we're going to multiply times some number n, where n is an integer. So we're going to write all angles coterminal with 30 degrees as this expression, 30 plus 360 times n. So let me show you what I mean by finding one positive and one negative angle. Let's say n is equal to 1. If n is 1, we'd have 30 plus 360 times 1. We'd be doing 30 degrees plus 1 full circle, and we'd get 30 plus 360 is 390 degrees. So what that looks like is we would be going from our initial side right here in the positive direction, a full 360 and an extra 30 degrees would be 390 degrees. We end up on that same terminal side right there. So this would be 390 degrees. That's an example of a positive coterminal angle. Let's think about a negative one. If I took 30 degrees, but I add 360 times -1, that's like taking 30 degrees and -1 times 360 would be like a minus 360. So 30 minus 360 would end up at negative 330 degrees. So here's an example of a negative coterminal angle, and let's see what that looks like. If I start at this initial side right here and I go back 90, 180, 270, and 60 more, I'd be at negative 330 degrees. I end up at that same terminal side right there. So this one would be negative 330 degrees. There are unlimited possible answers here, though. You could have many different other positive and negative angles. If I would have done one instead of 1, 2, and -2, or 3 and -3, as long as n is an integer, I'm going to get a positive or a negative coterminal angle. Okay, let's talk about radians and let's talk about negative angles. So let's say I have negative pi/4. We're going to do the same thing. So to find all my angles, let's write it as an expression. We would take negative pi/4 and we would add a full circle to that, which in radians is 2 pi times n, where n is an integer, because again, I could go not just one full circle, but 2 or 3 or 4, or backwards 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so on. So this is an expression that would give us all of those angles. So let's sketch negative pi over 4 and talk about this a little bit and find a positive and negative coterminal angle. If this is my initial side and I want to sketch negative pi over 4, then I'm going to be going backwards since it's negative. And if 90 degrees is pi over 2, then pi over 4 is half of a 90-degree angle. So I'm going to go backwards halfway to this line straight down right here. So pi over 4 is going to look something like that halfway through this fourth quadrant right here. So this is negative pi over 4. Let's find a positive and negative coterminal angle. To find a positive one, I could take negative pi over 4 and I could add 2 pi times a positive 1. Again, I don't have to use 1, but I'm just choosing a positive number that's easy to add here. So I'd have negative pi over 4 plus 2 pi. If I want to find a common denominator here, I could multiply this by 4 on the top and the bottom. So if I multiply times 4 on the bottom, I get 4. If I multiply 2 times 4 on the top, I could change this to an 8. 8 pi over 4 is the same thing as 2 pi. And negative 1 pi over 4 plus 8 pi over 4 would be 7 pi over 4. And what that looks like is if I take my pen and I start at this initial side, I go around 7 pi over 4 pieces, because think of these as pi over 4 pieces. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pi over 4, and I'm at that same terminal side. Okay, let's do a negative angle. Got my positive one. Negative angle time. Negative pi over 4. I could add 2 pi but multiply it times negative 1, for example, and I would get negative pi over 4 minus 2 pi. Remember, we said with the common denominator I could rewrite 2 pi as 8 pi over 4. That's the same thing. And if I have negative 1/4 minus 8/4, I'd be at negative 9/4 or negative 9 pi over 4. So let's talk about that. That would be, starting from this initial side, going backwards 9 pi over 4, which would be a full circle, which is 8 pi over 4 plus 1 extra pi over 4. I'd be back at my terminal side here. Let's check one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pi over 4 backwards. So this would be my negative coterminal angle. Again, just to repeat myself, you have multiple possible answers here. This is just one example of a positive and one example of a negative coterminal angle.